video is going to describe how you find the value of negative angles on the unit circle. So when you are on the unit circle, normally what you'd have here is you would have 0, you would have pi over 2, you would have pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, and you could keep going all the way around and incrementing in units of a half, but for now we're not too concerned about that. That was covered in a previous video. What we are concerned about is what happens when you have a negative value. So what's the difference? Well, the negative is going to cause you to move counterclockwise. So instead of going up like you did before, you're actually going to go down. So down here would be negative pi over 2. This would be negative pi. This would be negative 3 pi over 2. And this would be negative 2 pi. So the way that you're going to find out where your angles lie are where in between these values are they. So let's say we wanted to figure out where negative 7 pi over 6 was. Well, how would we do that? Well, one way to do that is to rewrite each of these numbers as if they had a denominator of 6. So this would be 0 pi over 6. This would be a negative 3 pi over 6. This would be negative 6 pi over 6. This would be negative 9 pi over 6. And this would be negative 12 pi over 6. So we can see that our negative 7 pi over 6 is within the second quadrant. It's in between negative 6 pi over 6 and negative 9 pi over 6. So let me go ahead and draw that in. See if I can get this. So let's put that right there. So that's around where negative 7 pi over 6 would be. Notice I made it a little closer to the negative 6 pi over 6 than the negative 9 pi over 6 because negative 7 is closer to negative 6 than it is to negative 9. Okay, so we've been able to figure out what quadrant it's in. This would be quadrant 2. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a note of that over here. Quadrant 2. Well, we know from our little device here, this all students take classes deal, that within the second quadrant, cosine is negative. So remember, should have written this earlier. We're trying to find the cosine. Let me write this here. The cosine of negative 7 pi over 6. Let's say that's the problem we want to do. So in the second quadrant, cosine is actually it's negative over there because only sine is positive. So because it's quadrant 2, that's going to indicate that our value is negative. Now, what about the actual value of it? Well, the actual value of it, we need to figure out what the reference angle is. So the reference angle would be this angle right here. It's the distance between our angle negative 7 pi over 6 and the x-axis. So if this whole thing is negative pi over 6, and we know our negative 7 pi over 6, and this part from here to here represents negative 6 pi over 6, then we know that the reference angle, the distance from here to here, would have to be pi over 6, the absolute value of the difference between negative 7 pi over 6 and negative 6 pi over 6. So this would be this would basically be like the negative, the cosine of pi over 6. Now, what is the cosine of pi over 6? Well, at this point, you should have it memorized from the unit circle that the cosine of pi over 6 would be root 3 over 2. So our full answer, the magnitude of the answer comes from the reference angle. This part right here, the reference angle tells us the magnitude, and then the quadrant tells us the sign. So our final answer would be negative square root of 3 divided by 2. In the next video, I'm going to do some more examples of problems where you're finding negative angles on the unit circle.